Well, hello, and it's time for Lecture 12, The Road to World War II. I may do something different here. Maybe I'll record a short intro and then start the actual lecture on another PowerPoint. We'll see how the mood strikes me. Once I get talking, I might not want to stop. So, one of the challenges to the students right now is that we're bouncing around in the 1930s. We just got done with an entire lecture about the Great Depression, which happened, of course, and the Great Depression and the New Deal, which was a 1930s thing. Now, everybody I've ever seen teach this class does the foreign policy part separate from the New Deal part. Otherwise, it would just be madness. You would be talking about, the Civilian Conservation Corps 1 minute, and then Benito Mussolini the second. It would just be too much. Your brains would melt. So we've gone through the New Deal, and then we did the midterm, and now we're going back to the beginning of the 1930s, and we're going through the 30s again. Completely different topic. But I just want you to keep that in mind, that while all this is going on, Roosevelt's also dealing with the Depression. Say what you will about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Love him, hate him, indifferent about him. He's a busy guy. He's juggling a lot of balls. Okay, he's got the Great Depression. He's got a troubled international situation. Okay, so this lecture is all about the road to World War II. Now, to confuse you even more, there's really two roads to World War II, because it's two separate, for the United States at least, and this is a U.S. history class, last I checked. There's really two separate wars going on here. One is war against Japan in the Pacific Ocean area, and the other is against Hitler in Europe and Mussolini. Now, I suppose you could go completely through the Pacific one time, back up, start all over again, and go completely through Europe. That would then be 3 passes through the 1930s, and then you wouldn't necessarily be able to correlate the two things that are going on. So this lecture, as laid out, says the road to World War II, but we're going to be bouncing back and forth. We're going to go from Asia to Europe, back to Asia, back to Europe. We'll be bouncing around like a pinball. If any of you actually know what a pinball machine is. So part of your job is to buckle down, keep up with what's going on, because there's a lot going on. The other thing you should know is one of Mr. Ferguson's 4 fields as a doctoral student is World War II. So guess what I like to talk about? Right, World War II. So expect to hear a lot of information over the next few lectures. All right, it's what I enjoy doing. That means you've got to suffer along with it too. Although a lot of students actually find it one of the more interesting units. Some don't, but some do. I know because students have told me both things. I once asked at the end of the semester, as the class was leaving after a final, a couple of hangers-on were hanging around to talk for a minute. I asked, what would you like to see different about the class? What do you wish we had done different? And one student said, I wish we had spent less time on World War II. And the other student said, really? I wish we'd spent more time on World War II. So welcome to my world. I can't please everybody. I can just try to do the best I can. So, I'm going to start by calling another audible. This outline starts with Japanese expansion in the Far East in 1931. But I want to give you a little bit of background material before this, because I'm a military history guy, and that's what I do. Right? So, at the end of World War I, a lot of people were trying to figure out, of course they didn't call it World War I, it was just the World War, or the Great War, but people were trying to figure out what causes, how did it happen, how can we avoid making this mistake again, which was part of the idea of the League of Nations. that Woodrow Wilson had, championed so hard. Of course, the United States did not join the League of Nations, but we were working diplomatically to try to help, ease international tensions. And I'm going to give you two examples of this. So, think back to World War I lecture, if you can remember that far back. I told you that in 1916, as part of the preparedness movement, that Congress had voted a huge naval appropriations bill to pour all kinds of money into the United States Navy. Okay? Now, it takes a long time to build these major warships. Battleships and battle cruisers is what we were talking about. It takes time to build these things. They're huge. And you got to accumulate the materials. At the end of the war, none of these ships that were coming out of this building program were ready in time to fight in World War I. Okay, but several of them were very well advanced in their construction process. Others had barely begun the process. So we have all these ships in various stages of completion. Okay? Now, most of the other combatants during World War I were broke from having spent so much money on the war. Okay, and one of the things that people thought might have led to World War I was a naval arms race, particularly between Germany and Great Britain. Great Britain always maintained a policy of trying to keep a navy big enough because, we have an overseas empire. They try to keep a navy as big as two likely opponents combined. Okay. When in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the Germans started building up a high sea fleet. Of course, the British see this as a threat. Okay? And so there's this naval arms race going on, largely between Great Britain and Germany, but other countries are involved as well as they try to build the biggest, baddest battleships they can. And this is kind of how it works. Somebody builds, I'm just going to make up numbers here, but someone builds, a 20,000-ton battleship with 12-inch guns. And so somebody turns around and builds a 24,000-ton battleship with 13-inch guns, trying to be, to where they can overpower their possible opponents. And then someone's going to turn around and build, let's say, a 27,000-ton battleship with 14-inch guns. Well, where does it stop? Where does it end? Okay. So, and this is tremendously expensive building ships like this. So, after the end of World War I, the United States was in a position to try to take some kind of leadership in trying to restrict any potential naval arms race. Okay? So we invite all these various naval powers to a series of conferences in Washington, D.C. to talk about limiting naval arms. Okay? And the bludgeon we can use is that we have this massive 1916 building program underway. We have several major ships, that are under construction, and we can afford to finish them out. And some of the other countries really can't get involved in a naval arms race. Now, Germany's out of the question because the Treaty of Versailles basically gutted their military, so we can take the Germans off the board. But there were still countries that were, worried about the cost of trying to build up these navies and this ever-increasing size of ships. So the Americans can invite these other countries in for these conferences to talk about these things. And the bargaining tool we have is that if nobody wants to sign something, well, we can go ahead and finish our major building plan, and that'll make us basically the largest navy. And so we'll show a willingness to sacrifice this if we can get everybody to play ball. Okay? So this is all taking place in Washington. This is in 1921 to 1922. Taking a quick peek there at the computer to make sure I got the dates right. Okay? You don't need to know what countries are involved. It says here, looks like 9 nations were involved in this. Don't worry about which ones they were. And they'll negotiate a series of various treaties. Okay? But the only one I really want you to know about necessarily is the 5-Power Treaty, which is usually just called the Washington Naval Treaty. Okay, and I don't think this may not be in the book. I looked in the index of the book before I started. I could not find it. Now, it doesn't mean it's not buried in the book somewhere, because the indexes don't always have everything. Okay, but let me put it up here on the screen to make sure you can see what I'm saying. It's the Washington Naval Conference, 1921 to 1922. I know it looks like a 7 because I was trying to use a Sharpie, but it's 1921 to 1922. There's this big peace conference held in Washington, D.C. to negotiate a naval arms limitation treaty. Now, this, as far as I know, is the first time this has been done, but this will continue. This idea continues, up into the Cold War. During the 1970s, the United States and the Soviet Union signed treaties to limit strategic weapons. Okay, and so this was seen as a way to possibly, help defuse this arms race. Okay, so there's several different treaties come out of this. Okay? But the one that I'm going to mention is the Five Power Treaty. And what it does is it establishes a ratio, okay, a building ratio or a fleet size ratio involving capital ships. Now, capital ships are the big battleships, battle cruisers sometimes. Okay, and I told you it's a Five Power Treaty. It establishes this ratio. Okay, now try to get that lined up here. It's a 5-5-3 ratio. Okay, one of the fives represents the United States of America. One of the fives represents Great Britain. The 3 represents the Empire of Japan. 1.67 represents France and Italy, but honestly, does anybody care about France and Italy when you talk about the Navy? No! So let's just call it, for our practical purposes, the 5-5 Free Treaty. Okay. Now here's the logic behind this. France and Italy can get by with a lesser degree of ships because they're mostly worried about the Mediterranean. Think about it. Italy's a peninsula, it's in the middle of an ocean, they need a navy, but they're bottled up in the Mediterranean Ocean because Great Britain, or the Mediterranean Sea, Great Britain controls Gibraltar, which is the access out into the Atlantic. Okay. France has a Mediterranean coast. So what this treaty does basically is establish parity between the Italian Navy and the French Navy. The French Navy's not so worried about the Atlantic because the British, who they have just fought a war with, are going to dominate the Atlantic. So here's how the British and the Americans look at this. Okay, now it's not an exact number of ships. It's not like 5 ships and 5 ships and 3 ships, but it's a ratio of tonnage, right, in ships. It's a little more complicated, but let's just say 5-5-3. Great Britain has a bigger allotment because they have a worldwide empire to take care of. They have holdings in both the Pacific and the Atlantic. Okay, Great Britain's in the Atlantic, but they have this worldwide empire: South Africa, India, Australia, New Zealand, all over the place, Hong Kong. The Americans also have 2 oceans to worry about, the Pacific and the Atlantic. Okay? The Japanese really only have to worry about the Pacific. So to the Americans and the British, this ratio seems totally fair because they have to worry about 2 oceans each, and the Japanese only have to worry about 1. The Japanese, though, see it as a bit of a slight because they look at it as they're being treated, as inferior to the other 2 Western powers. And if they were to ever go to war against Great Britain and the United States combined, if the Americans have half their fleet in the Pacific and the British have half their fleet in the Pacific, then you've got a 5-3 ratio against the Japanese. So the Japanese, although they signed the treaty for various reasons, weren't necessarily totally happy about it. Okay? It did some other things. It limited the size of warships, how big battleships could actually be, how big of a guns you could put on them. You could have the 35,000-ton battleship with 14-inch guns, and you couldn't build anything bigger. There was also a building holiday that would stop the building of ships for some time. Okay? And so America scraps its fleet in progress. I don't. We may have commissioned 1 or 2 of the ships, but we scrapped some of the older ships. I don't recall right off the top of my head. It's not important. But we scrapped ships that were the newest, biggest, best things we built, and some of them, like I said, they weren't quite finished yet, but we suspended construction of these things. Okay? Now, I'm coming up on the 15-minute mark, which is, I think, where YouTube times out. So let's call a stop here, and we'll come back in another minute with another video.